Not all things are what they seem, especially when it comes to history. The story of the Soviet war effort is one of incredible toughness, and their diet reflects that. These soldiers consumed things that would turn most stomachs, from foraged weeds to the bark from trees. What you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. 1. Black bread. Let's start with the absolute foundation of the Red Army diet, something that was more important than any weapon. Black bread. This wasn't the soft, dark pumpernickel you might find in a deli. To put it mildly, this was a dense, heavy, and often sour loaf made primarily from rye flour. Rye was a hardy grain that could grow in the harsh Russian climate, making it the perfect choice for feeding an enormous army. Every single soldier was supposed to receive a daily ration of about 2 pounds of this bread. That's a huge amount, and for a good reason. It was often the main source of calories they would get all day. What many overlooked is that the quality of this bread could vary wildly. On a good day, it was edible, something you could gnaw on to fill your stomach. On bad days, it was mixed with whatever fillers were available, like potato peels, sawdust, or even straw, just to make the flour stretch further. It was tough, coarse, and had to be sawed into pieces. Soldiers would often toast it over a fire to make it a little easier to eat and to get rid of any mold that might be growing on it. You can see this everywhere in old photos, soldiers clutching these dark, almost black loaves. They would eat it with soup, use it to scoop up stew, or just eat it plain. For many, this brick of rye was the only thing standing between them and starvation. This bread was the baseline, the one thing every soldier counted on. But when they got lucky, they got their hands on something that felt like a feast, a canned good that would become a legend in the Red Army. 2. Tushonka. While bread was the fuel, tushonka was the prize. The name, which is pronounced tushonka, just means stewed meat. But for the soldiers, it meant so much more. It was a can of pure, high-calorie gold. Tushonka was typically made from beef or pork that was stewed in its own fat and canned. This process preserved the meat for years, making it the perfect food for an army on the move. When a soldier got a can of tushonka, it was a major morale booster. It was a taste of real, hearty food in a world of bland porridge and hard bread. You see, tushonka was incredibly versatile. A soldier could heat it up over a small fire and eat it right out of the can for a warm, greasy, and deeply satisfying meal. The fat would melt, creating a rich broth that was packed with energy. Many people are crazy about adding it to other dishes. They would mix it into their kasha or millet porridge, turning a simple grain dish into a proper feast. This combination was so common, it even got its own name, buckwheat kasha with tushonka. The most shocking fact is that the fat, atiya, the top of the can, was just as valuable as the meat. Soldiers would scoop it out and spread it on their black bread, creating a high-energy snack that could keep them going for hours in the freezing cold. Tushonka was a Russian invention, a staple of their military. But their biggest ally sent over a different kind of canned meat, one that would become equally famous and, to some, infamous. 3. Spam. Not all things are what they seem, especially when they come in a rectangular blue can. Thanks to the Lend-Lease program, the United States shipped enormous amounts of supplies to the Soviet Union, and one of the most memorable items was Spam. Millions upon millions of cans of this American processed meat made their way to the Eastern Front. For Soviet soldiers who were used to the simple flavors of tushonka, Spam was something of an exotic mystery. It had a different texture, a different taste, and a saltiness that was a world away from their usual diet. The thing nobody tells you is how important this American food was. While some joked about the strange second front in a can, most soldiers were incredibly grateful for it. It was a reliable source of protein and fat in a time of great scarcity. Like tushonka, it could be eaten in a variety of ways. Soldiers would slice it and fry it if they had a chance, creating a crispy, salty treat. More often, they would chop it up and mix it into their soups and porridges to add flavor and much-needed calories. What many overlooked was the sheer scale of this operation. The United States sent over 100 million pounds of Spam to the Soviet Union. It became so common that it worked its way into the daily language of the soldiers. It was a symbol of the alliance, a taste of a different world delivered right to the front lines. It wasn't fancy, but it was food, and it helped feed an army that was on the brink of collapse. Spam and tushonka were luxuries. The day-to-day reality was a much simpler, grain-based meal that was cooked in huge batches right behind the front lines. 4. Kulesh. The backbone of the Soviet field kitchen wasn't canned meat. It was a humble porridge called kulesh. You see, kulesh was the ultimate working man's meal, a thick, hearty soup or stew made from whatever was on hand. The base was almost always some kind of grain, most commonly millet. Millet was cheap, easy to transport, and cooked up into a filling, if bland, mush. To this base, the field cooks would add whatever else they could find. This usually meant potatoes, onions, and maybe some carrots if they were lucky. The most shocking fact is that kulesh was often a one-pot meal for the entire day. The field kitchens, which were basically large horse-drawn carts with huge cauldrons, would set up just behind the fighting. They would cook massive batches of kulesh, and soldiers would line up with their metal mess tins to get their serving. On a good day, the cook might have some tushonka or Spam to stir in, which would make the kulesh 1,000 times better. But on most days, it was just grains and vegetables, maybe with a little bit of salted pork fat for flavor. To put it mildly, it wasn't exciting, but it was hot and it was filling. It provided the carbohydrates and energy needed for intense physical labor and fighting in the brutal Russian winters. Many soldiers would save a piece of their black bread to dip into the kulesh, making sure to soak up every last drop. It was the simple, reliable, and monotonous meal that fueled the Red Army. This porridge was the standard hot meal, but sometimes all a soldier had was something salty and dry, a taste of the sea far from any ocean. 5. Dried fish. Many people are crazy about the idea of fresh food, but for an army, preservation is everything. That's where dried fish known as wobla came in. Wobla is a type of roachfish from the Caspian Sea that is heavily salted and dried until it's as hard as a piece of wood. It's an ancient way of preserving food, and for the Red Army, it was a perfect source of protein that wouldn't spoil. These fish were lightweight, easy to pack, and could last for months without any refrigeration. You see, eating wobla was a bit of a process. You couldn't just bite into it. Soldiers would have to bang it against something hard, like a rock or the stock of their rifle, to break it up into smaller, edible pieces. Then they would chew on these salty, tough shards of fish. It was incredibly salty, which helped with hydration in a strange way, as it made the soldiers drink more water. The thing nobody tells you is that it was also a great source of essential minerals and oils. Soldiers would often just gnaw on a piece of dried fish as they marched, a simple, no-fuss snack. Sometimes they would chip off pieces and add them to their soup or kulesh to give it a salty, fishy flavor. It was a taste of home for many who grew up near Russia's great rivers and a practical, if tough, way to get protein when fresh meat was an impossible dream. This was a preserved food for the road. But on the front lines, especially in winter, soldiers often had to rely on whatever they could dig up from the frozen ground. 6. Frozen potatoes. The Russian winter was a weapon in itself, and it had a huge impact on the food supply. One of the most common and desperate food sources for Soviet soldiers was frozen potatoes. When the German army advanced, they often overran vast farmlands. The Soviets, in their retreat, sometimes had to leave behind entire harvests of potatoes in the fields. As the brutal winter set in, these potatoes froze solid in the ground. For hungry soldiers, these frozen, rock-hard spuds were a potential lifeline. Soldiers would have to use the tips of their bayonets or whatever tools they had to dig these frozen potatoes out of the icy earth. It was backbreaking work for a meager reward. You see, a frozen potato is not a normal potato. The freezing process changes its cellular structure. When you thaw it out, it becomes watery and sweet in an unpleasant way. The texture is mushy and the taste is, to put it mildly, not great. But not all things are what they seem. Despite the terrible taste and texture, these potatoes were still a source of carbohydrates. Soldiers would throw them into their fires to thaw them out, then boil them into a mushy stew or add them to their soups. What many overlooked is that this was a dangerous game. If the potatoes had frozen, thawed, and then refrozen multiple times, they could actually become toxic. But when you're starving, you take the risk. It was a grim harvest from a frozen battlefield. Digging for potatoes was one thing, but soldiers also had to learn to look for food growing above the ground, sometimes in the most unlikely places. 7. Foraged berries and mushrooms. When the official supply lines broke down, which happened all the time, soldiers had to turn into hunter-gatherers. The vast forests of Eastern Europe became a giant, if dangerous, pantry. Soldiers who knew what they were looking for could supplement their diet with foraged berries and mushrooms. This was a tradition that many of them grew up with in their home villages, so they knew which plants were safe to eat. In the summer and autumn months, they could find wild strawberries, raspberries, and bilberries. These berries were a fantastic source of vitamins, especially vitamin C, which helped prevent diseases like scurvy. Soldiers would eat them by the handful right off the bush for a burst of sweet energy. But the thing nobody tells you is that mushroom hunting was a much riskier business. Russia is famous for its delicious wild mushrooms like the porcini and the chanterelle. However, it is also home to some of the most poisonous mushrooms in the world, like the death cap. A single mistake could be your last. Many people are crazy about mushroom foraging, but it requires expert knowledge. Units that had soldiers from rural areas were at a huge advantage. These men could identify the safe mushrooms and bring back a haul to add to the communal cooking pot. Fried with a little bit of pork fat or added to a potato soup, these mushrooms added a deep, earthy flavor and a bit of much-needed protein to their diet. It was a taste of the wild that could make a terrible meal almost enjoyable. Berries and mushrooms were a treat. More often, the only green things available to eat were the kinds of plants most of us would consider weeds. 8. Grass and nettle. Soup. When the fields were bare and the forests had been picked clean, the definition of food started to get a lot broader. You see, in times of extreme hunger, Soviet soldiers would turn to making soup out of grass and nettles. This might sound shocking, but these common plants were often the only source of green vegetables available. Nettles, in particular, are surprisingly nutritious. When cooked, their sting goes away, and they taste a bit like spinach. They are packed with vitamins A and C as well as iron. The process was simple. Soldiers would gather bunches of young, tender nettle leaves, being careful not to get stung. They would also gather certain types of soft grasses. They would boil these greens in water with a lot of salt until they were soft and mushy. If they had a potato or an onion, they would throw it in to add a bit of substance. The result was a thin, green, and slightly bitter soup. To put it mildly, it wasn't a culinary delight. The most shocking fact is that this wasn't just some rare, desperate act. In many areas, especially during long sieges, this kind of weed soup became a regular part of the diet for for both soldiers and civilians. It was a way to get some vitamins into their bodies and to have something hot in their stomachs. It was a meal made from the lawn, a true testament to the will to survive. Eating weeds for vitamins was one strategy. Another was to brew a hot drink from the leaves of the most common trees in the forest. 9. Birch leaf tea. In the vast birch forests of Russia, soldiers found another unlikely source of nutrition: birch leaf tea. The birch tree is a symbol of Russia, and for the Red Army, it became a source of survival. You see, in the spring and early summer, the young, tender leaves of the birch tree are edible and can be brewed into a tea. This wasn't a drink for pleasure, it was a drink for health. What many overlooked is that these leaves contain a surprising amount of vitamin C. Scurvy was a constant threat to armies throughout history. It's a nasty disease caused by a lack of vitamin C that leads to bleeding gums, weakness, and eventually it can be fatal. With fresh fruits and vegetables almost impossible to get on the front lines, soldiers had to find other sources of this crucial vitamin. Birch leaf tea was one of the answers. Soldiers would collect the young leaves, crush them to release their oils, and steep them in hot water. The resulting tea was slightly bitter and had a woody, earthy flavor. The thing nobody tells you is that they would also use the sap of the birch tree. In the early spring, they could tap the trees and collect the watery sap, which could be drunk as is or boiled down into a slightly sweet syrup. It was another small way that the natural world around them provided a defense against the diseases of malnutrition. This forest tea was a bitter medicine. For a different kind of drink, one that tried to imitate a beloved comfort from home, they had to look down at the forest floor. 10. Acorn coffee. Coffee was an impossible luxury on the Eastern Front, but the desire for a hot, dark, bitter drink remained. To fill this void, soldiers created a substitute known as acorn coffee. The process was laborious, but for those desperate for a taste of normalcy, it was worth it. First, they had to gather acorns from oak trees. Raw acorns are full of tannins, which are bitter and bad for your stomach, so they had to be processed first. You see, the soldiers would shell the acorns and then boil them repeatedly, changing the water each time to leach out the bitter tannins. Once the acorns were no longer bitter, they would be dried and roasted over a fire until they were dark brown and brittle, just like coffee beans. Then they would grind them up into a coarse powder using a rock or the butt of a rifle. This powder could then be brewed with hot water to create a dark, bitter liquid that looked a lot like coffee. Of course, it contained no caffeine and didn't taste exactly like real coffee. It had a nutty, earthy flavor that was an acquired taste. But not all things are what they seem. It was a hot, comforting beverage that could be enjoyed during a rare moment of rest. It was a simple trick, turning a common nut from the forest into a morale-boosting drink that reminded them of a life before the war. These foraged items helped stretch the rations. But when the rations ran out completely, soldiers had to turn to a source of meat that was a common sight on every farm and in every village. 11. Horse meat stew. For many cultures, eating horse meat is a taboo, but in the brutal reality of the Eastern Front, it was a simple necessity. Horse meat stew became an incredibly common meal for the Red Army. You see, the Army still used a massive number of horses to pull wagons, artillery, and field kitchens. When a horse was wounded or could no longer work, it wasn't just left behind. It was immediately repurposed as a source of food. It was a grim but practical reality. The thing nobody tells you is that horse meat is actually very lean and nutritious. It's high in protein and iron. However, it can also be very tough, especially if the horse was old and had been worked hard. The best way to cook it was to stew it for a very long time. Field cooks would chop the meat into small pieces and boil it for hours with potatoes, onions, and whatever root vegetables they could find. The long, slow cooking process would help to break down the tough muscle fibers and make the meat tender. What many overlooked was the psychological aspect of this. These weren't just animals. They were often comrades that had served alongside the soldiers for months or even years. To go from working with a horse one day to eating it the next was a difficult thing for many soldiers to accept. But hunger is a powerful motivator, and in the end, survival came first. Eating a work animal was hard, but the war would force soldiers to eat animals that were even closer to home, starting with the birds that filled the skies over every ruined city. 12. Crow or pigeon. In the desperate urban warfare of cities like Stalingrad, the normal food supply chain completely collapsed. Soldiers and civilians were trapped in ruined cities with nothing to eat. In this environment, they had to hunt whatever they could find. This meant that crows and pigeons, birds that are a common sight in any city, suddenly became a vital source of protein. Soldiers would use slingshots or try to trap these birds on rooftops and in bombed-out buildings. You see, a crow or a pigeon is not a big bird. There isn't a lot of meat on them. But for a starving person, every single calorie counts. Once they caught a bird, they would pluck its feathers, clean it, and usually boil it. The most common way to prepare it was to make a thin, watery soup. They would boil the entire bird, bones and all, to extract as much flavor and nutrition as possible. A single pigeon might be shared among several soldiers. To put it mildly, the taste was gamey and strong, not at all like chicken, but it was meat. It was a small victory in a world of constant defeat, a tiny bit of sustenance that could give them the energy to fight for one more day. The most shocking fact is how organized this became. Some soldiers became expert bird hunters, their daily job being to stalk the ruins for anything with wings. Hunting city birds was one level of desperation, but soon soldiers and civilians would be forced to turn on the animals they had once kept as companions. 13. Dog stew. This is where the story takes a truly heartbreaking turn. When the hunger became unbearable, the ultimate taboo had to be broken. Soldiers and civilians, especially during the horrific siege of Leningrad, resorted to eating dogs. A dog stew was a meal born of the absolute last resort. These weren't wild animals. They were pets, the loyal companions that had lived alongside people in their homes. The decision to eat a dog was a sign that all other options had been exhausted. The thing nobody tells you is the profound sense of shame and grief that came with this. People would often weep as they prepared the meal, but the drive to survive, and especially the drive to feed their starving children, was stronger than any taboo. They would use every part of the animal, making a thin stew from the meat and bones. It was a dark and terrible meal that left a permanent psychological scar on those who had to eat it. What many overlooked is that this wasn't an isolated incident. In the brutal calculus of a siege, any source of calories becomes a viable option. The story of the Soviet war effort is filled with these kinds of horrifying choices, where the lines between what is food and what is not become blurred by unimaginable suffering. It's a stark reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization can be when people are pushed to the absolute limit. If eating dogs was a sign of the end, there was one other common household pet that would also become a source of food in the darkest of times. 14. Cat meat. Just like dogs, cats also became a source of food during the most desperate times of the war. In the besieged cities, where every scrap of food was gone, cat meat was another grim addition to the menu. You see, cats are smaller than dogs and have even less meat on them, but for starving people, they were a target. Soldiers and civilians would hunt them in the alleys and basements of ruined buildings. This was especially common during the siege of Leningrad, which lasted for nearly 900 days. The most shocking fact is that as the siege went on, The cat population of the city was almost completely wiped out. They were either eaten or they starved, along with the people. A popular saying from that time was that the only thing left to eat was the glue from the wallpaper. Preparing cat meat was similar to preparing other small animals. It was usually boiled in a stew to make the tough, stringy meat more palatable and to use every part of the animal. To put it mildly, this was a horrifying choice for people to have to make. But it's a critical part of understanding the reality of the war on the Eastern Front. It wasn't just about battles and tanks. It was about an entire population pushed to the brink of extinction by starvation. The memories of these meals haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives, a dark secret from a time when all the normal rules of society had broken down. Cats and dogs were a last resort in the cities, but there was another, even more reviled animal that became a food source when there was nothing left to hunt. 15. Rats. For most of us, the idea of eating a rat is the stuff of nightmares. But in the hellscape of a besieged Soviet city, rats became a life-saving source of protein. You see, while all the other animals were disappearing, the rat population sometimes thrived in the rubble and ruins. They were survivors, just like the people, and for the most desperate, they became prey. Soldiers would set traps for them in the sewers and destroyed buildings. The thing nobody tells you is the incredible risk involved. Rats are carriers of all sorts of terrible diseases. Eating a rat that was not cooked thoroughly could be a death sentence. But when the alternative was certain starvation, it was a risk many were willing to take. They would skin the rats, clean them as best they could, and boil them for a very long time to try and get rid of any germs. The meat was said to be tough and have a very unpleasant taste. But it was meat. What many overlooked is that in the desperate economy of a siege, rats even became a commodity. People would trade their last possessions for a captured rat. It's a horrifying image, but it shows the unbelievable conditions that people were forced to endure. It represents the absolute bottom, the point where any living creature becomes a potential meal. Eating rats was the reality of a siege. But even in the open country, soldiers sometimes had to make their food out of things that were never meant to be eaten, starting with the very trees around them. 16. Pine bark bread. When the flour for their black bread ran out, the field bakeries had to get creative in the most desperate ways. This led to the creation of things like pine bark bread. You see, the inner bark of certain pine trees, a layer called the cambium, is actually edible. It's not very nutritious, but it can be dried and ground into a powder that can be used as a substitute or a filler for flour. Soldiers would strip the bark from pine trees and carefully peel away this inner layer. The process was time-consuming. The cambium had to be dried completely, often over a fire, and then pounded and ground into a fine powder. This bark flour would then be mixed with whatever real flour was available, sometimes making up more than half of the mixture. They would also add things like sawdust or straw to add even more bulk. The resulting bread was, to put it mildly, terrible. It was heavy, had a strong pine resin taste, and was incredibly difficult to digest. The most shocking fact is that while it kept the feeling of hunger at bay, it provided very few actual nutrients. It was mostly indigestible fiber. But for a soldier who hadn't eaten in days, a piece of this hard, bitter bread felt like a real meal. It was another example of how they used the forest itself as a last-ditch source of sustenance, turning the trees into a source of calories. Using tree bark was a way to make bread out of nothing, but often the problem wasn't a lack of grain, but that the grain they had was already ruined. 17. Weevil-infested grains. Logistics in wartime are a nightmare. Food supplies could sit in damp warehouses or be transported in leaky train cars for weeks on end. This meant that by the time bags of grain, like millet or buckwheat, reached the front lines, they were often spoiled. It was incredibly common for soldiers to open a sack of grain and find it crawling with weevils and other insects. In a normal situation, this food would be thrown away immediately. But on the Eastern Front, nothing was wasted. You see, the soldiers had a grimly practical approach to this problem. They couldn't afford to throw away the food, so they would simply cook the insects along with the grain. Many people are crazy about the idea of eating bugs now, but this was not a choice. The weevils and their larvae would be boiled into the porridge, becoming an unwanted but unavoidable source of extra protein. Some soldiers would try to sift the bugs out, but it was often an impossible task. The thing nobody tells you is the psychological effect. Eating food that you know is crawling with bugs is a deeply unpleasant experience. But it was just one more hardship that they had to endure. It was a constant reminder of how broken the supply chain was and how close they were to having nothing at all. They would close their eyes, swallow the gritty, buggy porridge, and try to think of it as extra nourishment, extra nourishment, extra nourishment, extra nourishment.